The creation of highly capable general purpose AI systems marks the beginning of a new era for our world. The pace of change is already extraordinary and it is accelerating. This is why AI matters so much to the question of sovereignty today. The systems that will define the future require massive amounts of capital, talent, and energy. They depend on global supply chains and economies of scale, mean that frontier AI development is likely to remain concentrated among a small number of actors. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Analytics Insight podcast, where we talk about the ever evolving tech space. And I'm your host, Priya Dialani. Faced with this reality, many leaders are now asking what steps they should take to stay in control of their country's future. The instinctive response is often to try to do everything at home, to build fully sovereign AI, and treat reliance on partners as a threat. Joining us today is Mishi Choudhary, technology lawyer and founder of SFLC.in, to explore that as AI systems become deeply embedded in economies and governance, how far can India afford to rely on foreign frontier AI models which it neither owns, controls, trains, or even understands? Hi, Mishi. A very warm welcome to our podcast today.
Thank you very much. Very happy to be here with you.
Likewise, it's a pleasure to have you with us today, Mishi. And I think data sovereignty has, I think, become such an important discussion today, considering the acceleration and development of AI solutions. Particularly, of course, we will be talking in the Indian context today. But overall,
Mhm.
I think the global atmosphere has changed completely when we talk about, data sovereignty and ownership.
Mhm.
And we are going to discuss a lot about that today. So let's start by telling our listeners more about SFLC.in, what exactly is the vision and mission of the company, and alongside that, a little bit about you, Mishi. How has your journey been till date, and what led you to, open up and start SFLC.in?
Sure, thank you. This is my passion and life, so always happy to talk about it. I am a lawyer. I practice law in the US as well as in India. I started SFLC.in in 2010. That time it was very much about, I had spent some time studying in the US as well as in Europe. And I had seen that there were a lot of organizations that were working on citizens' rights. What was the role of a user and a citizen when they used technology? And I wanted to be back in India and work at such an organization. There was only one organization, but it was a research-based organization, which was Center for Internet and Society. And I thought, oh, I don't have a place where lawyers, journalists, economists, technologists can get together and think about how policy impacts all of these decisions. And India already had made its mark in terms of IT talent and what India's infrastructure that time was. So I started the organization myself because I wanted a place to work. And then slowly and steadily, the organization started to grow and do much more work at the intersection of law, tech, and policy. We started to think about online free speech and expression, privacy. We started to talk about advertising data, but the DNA of the organization has always stayed free and open source software. And that came from my earlier training, providing legal help to open source projects like various projects at the Apache Software Foundation, Samba, Linux Foundation, the Linux kernel, the GNU project, OpenSSL, Debian, etc. And the philosophy mostly was if we cannot understand technology, then we cannot control technology. And most of our lives aspects are going to be mediated via technology. So if you don't know what's going on in every decision about your life, financial, insurance, education, medical, and even what you say to your loved ones or outsiders is going to be governed by technology. So you might as well have control over it. And the basics were you should be able to see what's in the computer, and not just computers or other people who know how to make software. They should not be telling you how to live your lives. And that has always been our philosophy. We always keep the user, the citizen, the person at the center, and that's our North Star. Is this policy good for people? Is this policy going to have an adverse impact on their rights, their abilities to just live a normal life? Because most users have a full-fledged personal and professional life, and they don't have time to read long privacy policies, go to court all the time. So that's our job. So that's what we do. And we started to dabble into Indic language computing, natural language processing, and many other things very early on when these words were not hot or sexy, when machine learning was slowly transforming what we now call AI. But that's been the journey. We're a little ahead. We try to get into things when nobody thinks they're important. And then suddenly they're very, very important. And now the conversation is everywhere. I work in the US and in India, and the conversations overlap, but they're also very different in certain aspects. So, but very excited about how much, whether it is young or old, or no matter what kind of profession people are in, how important these things are to them and how engaged people are in contrast to when I started. So happy to be here also to talk to you and your audience about these matters.
Thank you for that great overview, Mishi. And I completely agree with what you said. And I particularly like that if you don't understand the technology, we won't be able to control it effectively. And I'm really glad to, understand about your role and contributions and, the kind of vision SFLC.in is involved into and the overall problem it is, trying to solve within the industry.
Well, thank you. It is people like you, one step at a time, who help us spread the mission and add to our work.
Yes, definitely, Meshi. So moving ahead, I think, of course, you also said that sovereign AI has rapidly become a strategic focus, and it is not just only for the governments, but also for enterprises across public and private sectors. Traditionally driven by national security and regulatory compliance, the concept is now gaining traction within regulated industry and commercial enterprises which are looking to maintain strict data control compliance with their customers and stakeholders. So, how should we truly define AI sovereignty, and why is this conversation becoming so important globally?
So we've actually, going back in history, we have seen how software industry developed, how internet developed. Now we also saw the success of open systems and where things lie. The US hyperscalers are at the forefront of all of this. And what has happened is these big companies are developing proprietary software, which mostly means they lock their software. We have no idea how this technology works. And they first offer it for free or at very low costs. And then once our governments, our public infrastructure, our people get dependent on them, and the fee goes up and our dependence is intertwined with it. For a very long time, we would say that geopolitics and technology are interdependent. Trade, tech, geopolitics are also going to work together. However, because it was mostly understood to be either IT services or social media, governments came to all this realization a little late. But once they realized, they understood how their citizens were interacting with the government, how they were interacting with each other, and how they were conducting their financial life, their educational life, their medical life, and their personal life, in addition to the professions they were in, they also realized how much dependence they had on mostly Silicon Valley based companies. And these companies have revenue models of exploiting data and selling eyeballs to advertisers. But they're also very, very much so much bigger, and their revenues dwarf GDPs of several countries. But they were also a big part of the US industrial policy. So it was US value system, US laws, US companies, all of them dominated the world. Then we saw the value systems were different. Europe thinks about certain things very differently. India thinks about many matters in its own way. And China, Iran, Russia, they have their own ways because countries, national boundaries also give them sovereignty. They want to control their own destiny. So we saw that. And because there was so much of dependence on Silicon Valley, now that this wave of machine learning turning into AI is coming, the governments do not want to be left behind. They don't want their dependence on only one set of companies. US has also not done itself any favors in the past few years by completely abandoning its position in the world by looking inwards. We're also seeing the exploitative ways of how these companies work in tandem with US policy. And that's why every country now wants to ensure that they control their own destiny. So that is why the sovereignty piece is becoming so much more important. But it's a little hard to define sovereignty because it does not mean that it is isolationism, like, oh, I'm going to be isolated, I'm not going to be working with anybody, because that's not how the world works anymore. And also, it does not mean states control over AI. Oh, only the government will control, and anyone the government likes, they will control. It, from my point of view, and especially why I think open source and the free and open source value system fits perfectly with sovereignty, is because AI sovereignty actually means that it's the real ability of a society to understand, to build, adapt, inspect, and govern the AI systems on which it depends. So that means, like, if it is compute ability, all the computers which are going to do the calculation, it's the data, the models that we use, the standards that we tell them this they must meet, our technologies must meet, the skills of our own people, the procurement choices of what the government buys, and some accountability, legal and otherwise. All of these matters need to be about what country wants to control by its people, for its people. And that is becoming important globally now because whoever will control the models, the chips, the APIs, they are going to actually shape the economies, how speech is conducted, what our security looks like, what kind of new innovation will come, what kind of public services delivery infrastructure will come. If we see China, they have been playing a very long game and a very, very sharp, smart game. They are strategically linking AI to national technological power. And that's why I would say the sovereignty bit becomes so much more important for everybody. And the goal of, for example, the Chinese is to embed intelligence systems in physical products of every description sold throughout the world, because they are the manufacturers, they are the factories of the world. So they're going to put AI in everything, and then their products are going to be sold everywhere. Now, that's why they rely on open source, because that free and open source software, that kind of development gives the industry technical flexibility. It also gives them resistance to any anti-competitive oligopolies. And then they can design on low capital intensity of production. So smaller power requirements, etc. And the anxieties of the government about potential development of private power, which is going to be so much bigger if it's only going to be Anthropic or OpenAI or DeepMind who are going to control all of this. That's why I think every government on the planet wants to ensure that its own populations, as well as itself, they can control their own destiny. And I'm not surprised at that. That's where we were headed. If anybody paid attention in the past 15 years of where tech policy has been going, this was writing on the wall. And that's why the question becomes important.
Right. And I think this is a very important perspective at a time when countries are no longer looking at AI as just another technology trend, but as a critical infrastructure tied to economic growth and innovation and even security. And
Mhm.
I think what makes the conversation around AI sovereignty so fascinating is that it goes beyond just, simply building AI models. It also
Mhm.
touches down on who controls the data, who owns
Yeah.
the compute infrastructure, and eventually, how nations can reduce dependence on a handful of global tech providers.
Absolutely. That's exactly the right summary of the important matters that are driving this emphasis by several players on sovereignty.
Right. And I think one question that is dominating boardroom and governments alike is that how do we steer AI rather than be steered by it? Nearly 4 out of 5 organizations call AI sovereignty a strategic topic, and 90% cite open source as essential to achieving it. So why, I mean, what are your views on it, and why everybody is saying that true AI sovereignty will be difficult to achieve without open source ecosystems?
So I think why they're saying is it is very simple because true sovereignty is impossible if key systems are locked down. If major systems are going to be black boxes, which are going to be controlled by some foreign vendors, then how are you going to even know what they do? And then you're just paying them rent all the time, and then you're reliant on them to work with you. Open source ecosystems will allow inspection. They will allow any local adaptation. We can do security reviews. And it doesn't have to be locked down to one entity. It encourages competition. There will be education because universities can open up, students can look into it. Independently, they can be deployed. And that's the freedom to use, study, modify, and share, not just provide marketing access to a model. And the long-term risks are the same, which we've always seen. That's why companies like Microsoft used to call open source cancer, but then they became open source companies because open source defeated everybody. The long-term risks are again vendor lock-in. There's going to be price extraction. Once you are locked into one vendor, you like them, you're so dependent, they can do whatever they want with pricing. There will be surveillance. Accountability goes down, and domestically, technical capacity goes down. It's not that everybody is doing the research and development in India, and things are not being dictated by where the national country or origins of these models. And there is policy dependence on companies which are outside of the democratic control of those governments. So then a country can appear that they're digitally advanced, but structurally they're dependent on something else. You saw as railways, you are dependent on a Google infrastructure, or you're dependent on another infrastructure which is opaque. The APIs you can't look into, the clouds are foreign, the training data is not available, terms of service are fixed, you can't negotiate with them. And then they all have, oh, we are bound by this country's rules and that country's rules, etc. So there is all of those things that come with proprietary software. So that is why the attraction of open source is, oh, we can actually do something different here right now. Again, I keep pointing out China, which was not ever on anybody's bingo card, but I will say China had started to look into open source very, very seriously around 2010 and 11. So this is why these are long-term gains, and long companies must and governments must invest thinking 15 years down, what's going to be the changes? 25 years down, what are we going to do? So now when China started looking at it, Huawei started to get IBM, and other such large companies which were early adopters of open source or projects, Cloud Native Computing Foundation, various other projects, Apache and this and that. China's developers started getting interested, adapting, participating, etc. So they understood how important this will be as an infrastructure. They built their own operating systems, they built their own hardware. So that's why right now, China doesn't have to catch up with anybody. They are just building a completely parallel AI ecosystem, which is mostly open weight, not really open source, but they are open. They have Chinese alternatives for compute. Their government, the state, it backs industrial coordination, and that really changes the power structure in the global world. Now, a few years ago, we saw a lot of open models that came from Meta or the European Mistral. Today, most of the competitive open available models are Chinese. Whether you look at the Quen family of models from Alibaba or ByteDance or Huawei or DeepSeek, all of these are now, it's not just about how big the number of open models are, open weight models, it's also how quickly they release them and the pricing, the openness, the deployment strategy, etc. And that's why you can see the entire strategic power that the Chinese have given themselves by relying on the talent of global developers, but also pushing for the right places where the advantage is for that country. So if you see Hugging Face, that is the global AI infrastructure for open models, where open models are distributed, benchmarked, etc. And policymakers underestimate this because they are not seeing that Silicon Valley is not dominating here. This is the place where somebody else is dominating. And that creates important consequences for countries like ours in India or other countries in Global South also. 54 countries in Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, which tells you that AI no longer requires complete dependence on US models, which are closed API. Any university, IIT, any state government, small, big, anybody can run a highly capable model locally or on infrastructure which is built like in their own country. And so such ecosystems, because you are talking to several people from different countries participate. So that also reduces your geopolitical dependencies.
Right.
Um, so that's why we see that.
Right. And I think that's very important considering that sovereignty is not just about having access to AI models. It's about owning the underlying ecosystem, the infrastructure, data governance frameworks, and the ability to innovate independently over the long term. And
Mhm.
I think for countries like India, this becomes even more critical because the challenge is not about competing globally, but building AI systems that can understand our regional context and population scale challenges.
Mhm.
With that being said, Mishi, I think accelerated digitization and the rise of AI also calls for new industrial policies. As value in the global economy shift towards knowledge intensive activities, decision makers need to support the adoption and development of new technologies. So, with whatever we discussed right now, what policy and regulatory changes as a country India should adopt to support the open AI innovation and reduce the ecosystem concentration?
Great question. India's come up with a few things here in terms of papers, in terms of what their India AI mission looks like. But I think one of the major things which India has not done is we haven't changed our procurement rules. So when the government is buying anything, India has in the e-governance project a mandatory open source policy. It doesn't follow its own policy. So when they are procuring something, if it's a government agency, state government, central government, courts, or anyone, the procurement should mandate that we need open models. That reduces dependencies. That reduces obviously the costs because then you can adapt and you can change certain things. So public funding, anything where the government is putting money, that they should say, whatever we are investing in, this is taxpayers' money. So it should be openly licensed. It should not be tied up to anything. See, anyway, a closed system, whether it is an Indian system or an American system, is just a bad system. If you replace Google with Reliance, it's not going to be better off, because what we want is the ability to have an entire country have access, not one player replace the other player. So if you're putting taxpayers' money, then make sure that anything which comes out from universities, whatever is being funded, it requires open licensing. So free and open licensing is wherever we need, where it is appropriate, obviously. Then we also need auditability duties for high impact AI. If it's going to take, if some of these models are you're going to deploy somewhere, you're going to do like really important decisions are going to be taken. If you're going to put it in your policing system, if you're going to do it in your health system or financial system, then you really need to be able to see what the trail is and be able to audit these systems. You can't just say, oh yeah, whatever, they're there, but we're not going to be able to look under the hood and decide what really happened. Competition law becomes really important here. That's one thing America has mostly been snoozing, because the policies are such. They did show a little bit of spark in the last administration, but that's about it. But there should be competition enforcement against AI gatekeepers. If 4 or 5 people are going to become gatekeepers and stop others from entering it, then we need to use competition law there. One important thing, which I think is irrespective of AI, and I've been thinking about it, talking about it for a very, very long time. I think India prides itself about digital public infrastructure, which is great, but India has failed on cybersecurity front. So when you build good digital public infrastructure, you must ensure that people's data is not leaked. Data in India is leaked left, right, and center and doesn't even make any front page news anymore. And that is our failure, that we do one thing so well, but when we don't complement it with the right kind of other policies, then we fail. So you can't say, I'm going to force all of the citizens to be digital and then not protect their data. So, and there are public data sets which will be now used to train these models and to develop other things. So you have to provide safe access. The ability should be that people should be able to access them safely so that they can build on that. But then it needs to be, safety must be pronounced. It also needs to ensure that they're secure. India has a great diversity of languages. It's one of our great pride. Whether you look at the recognized ones in the Constitution schedule or otherwise also. So we need to provide the support for Indian language models. And copyright and data rules should not like criminalize legitimate research, etc. I think because of IP lawyers, some of the Bollywood folks, we just went into complete other extreme of making copyright into this most important thing and sending people in jail. And that kind of stuff doesn't make for an ecosystem which is rich for innovation. You need people to be able to research on it and legitimately get access to these models. So those policies will have to be changed. And this piecemeal way India does advisories here and that there, most of the emphasis on these matters, important matters from agencies, is about social media. And that needs to go away. That's not as important for our future as investing in all of these other ecosystem infrastructure is. And as I said, it is a long-term game. Chinese have been playing it with the right keen eye for the country. And we need to do better because we have great talent and we have great infrastructure in terms of human infrastructure to be able to tap into this moment.
Right, Mishi. And I think I very well agree to your point that it's really important to balance innovation with accountability. Because while governments, specifically with the Indian context, like you mentioned, they want to encourage rapid AI development, but there is also growing pressure around, transparency and ensuring responsible deployment. And finding that balance is going to define how competitive and inclusive national AI ecosystem within India will become over the next decade. And I think countries that can create open, collaborative AI ecosystems may ultimately accelerate innovation far more effectively than those relying only on closed platforms. Well, said that, Mishi, it was a really great conversation with you. And I think, you helped us understand that the concept of sovereign AI is evolving beyond a national policy matter, and it is becoming a strategic capability that I think not just organizations but governments across the globe must consider, specifically India, like you mentioned. And as privacy regulations intensify, AI models become more central to business operations, and geopolitical tensions persist. So the ability to develop and operate AI systems independently and compliantly will become a very core requirement for countries. And it was great chatting with you, Mishi. And again, thank you for guiding us and helping that sovereign AI systems can unlock new efficiencies and also deliver ethical insurance. All of these are very vital to sustaining AI at a scale in a very complex world that we are living in. So thank you for your insights, Mishi. It was wonderful talking to you.
Thank you for your patience and also interest in nerdier topics and looking at how important they are for all of us in terms of participation in policy and influencing which direction India goes.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Mishi. This is for our listeners. I hope you enjoyed today's discussion around sovereignty in the age of AI, and I think how future-oriented decisions about how AI is integrated, governed, and used in line with its national goals will be of question in the coming years. Stay tuned for upcoming episodes, and you can view all our previous episodes on Spotify and other leading platforms. Thank you so much.